Beneath a canopy of foliage lies Barnes Cemetery. This tiny 2-acre burial site is one of many founded during the 1800s to address the acute need for more burial spaces for London's rapidly increasing population. It was opened in 1854, and by the mid-1900s it had no room for more burials. Over the next 30 years, it became one of the most neglected and derelict burial grounds in the United Kingdom. Come with me as we explore the story of this unfortunate Victorian garden cemetery. Unlike most 19th century cemeteries, Barnes was not launched by a commercial company or a local authority. It was established by St. Mary's, an Anglican church in Barnes in southwest London. A church has stood here since the 11th century, but since that time it's been substantially modified numerous times. Many of its parishioners now rest in its churchyard, which by the middle of the 1800s was reaching capacity and was closed for burials in 1857. Fortunately, St. Mary's anticipated the need for more burial spaces and acquired a 2-acre section of Barnes Common, which was owned by the Dean and chapter of St. Paul's Cathedral, London. The site was enclosed and landscaped, and though they no longer exist, a keeper's lodge and Anglican mortuary chapel were erected. The cemetery opened for burials in 1854. The memorials here are more modest than those in larger cemeteries, but there are still some fine monuments, the Hedgeman families being the largest. The first to be interred in this tomb was William Hedgeman, who was 27 years old when he died in 1869. His older brother, James Wilmot, died 7 years later. The patriarch of the family, James, a local businessman, died in 1877. His wife, Charlotte, was 37 years old when she died in 1853. The last to be interred here was James's sister, Elizabeth, whose remains were brought here from Abney Park Cemetery for reinterment. Other notables who lie in the cemetery include Ebenezer Cobb Morley, who was a solicitor in London and an avid sportsman. He set up the Football Association in 1862. With others, he established his governing body and created the game's first official rules. He also established and captained Barnes Football Club. He was 93 when he died in 1924. Postman's Park in London was once a graveyard. Today, the park has a memorial containing 54 plaques dedicated to ordinary persons who gave their life in an attempt to save someone else's. One plaque is dedicated to 26-year-old Samuel Rabbit, a doctor at the Royal Free Hospital in London. He died in 1884 after he contracted diphtheria when he used a tube to suck the mucus from the windpipe of a 4-year-old patient who had the highly contagious disease. His gravestone is inscribed with details of his brief career. Edward Williams was a successful painter who died in 1855. His 6 sons and several of his grandchildren also painted British landscapes, and their art became known as the Barnes School of Painting. Alexander Joseph Finberg was an art critic, illustrator and painter. In 1905, the trustees of the National Gallery commissioned him to catalogue paintings bequeathed to the gallery by Joseph Mallard William Turner, the English Romantic painter. In 1909, Finberg published a 2-volume complete inventory of the drawings of the Turner bequest. Finberg died in 1939, aged 73. James Haywood was a barrister and a Fellow of the Statistical Society. He opened the first free library in Kensington in 1874. He served as a Liberal MP for North Lancashire for 10 years, and he was 87 when he died in 1897. The 1858 gravestone of William Frickley has a flying hourglass with a snake with its tail in its mouth. It's a symbol of eternity that was especially popular in the 18th century. Charles Lofting, son of Elgar Lofting, was killed on active service in France in 1917 during the First World War. His brother Henry also died overseas in Bombay in 1930. Several military veterans lie in the cemetery. Charles Walter Graham was just 23 when he was killed in combat in 1916 while on sea patrol during the First World War. Some of the casualties of the two world wars lie in graves maintained by the Commonwealth Graves Commission, 7 from World War I and 3 from World War II.
Somewhere in this cemetery lie the partial remains of a victim of a notorious murder. It's been called the Richmond murder or the Barnes murder.
In a cottage on this site on Park Road in Richmond lived Julia Martha Thomas, a 55-year-old widow and retired teacher. In January 1879, Mrs. Thomas hired as a maid Kate Webster, a young Irish woman, even though she was known to have served time in prison for robbery. 2 months later, during a row between the two women, Kate Webster pushed Mrs. Thomas down the stairs, strangled her, and then cut off her head, chopped up the rest of her body, and boiled the lot in a copper pot. She walked 3 doors up the road to the hole-in-the-wall public house and offered them the liquid as lard.
According to the detective who investigated this murder case, Webster offered the lard as free soup to 2 young boys, and apparently they drank 2 bowls of it.
Posing as Mrs. Thomas, Webster sold off her furniture, clothes, jewellery, and even her false teeth. With the help of an unsuspecting acquaintance, Webster dumped some of Mrs. Thomas's remains over Richmond Bridge into the Thames River. When these were discovered 2 weeks later on the shoreline near the old railway bridge in Barnes, Webster bolted to Ireland with her young son. However, she was followed, arrested, and returned to London. After a 6-day trial at the Old Bailey and just an hour's deliberation, the jury found her guilty and she was sentenced to death. A short time before she was hanged at Wandsworth Prison, Webster made a full confession.
The whereabouts of Mrs. Thomas's skull remained a mystery for 131 years.
However, in 2010, a skull was found by workmen at the back of the derelict The Hole-in-the-Wall pub, which had been bought for development by next-door neighbour, legendary naturalist David Attenborough. The skull was identified as being that of Mrs. Thomas and was buried in Richmond Cemetery. By the 1950s, there were about 3,000 bodies interred here, and there was little space for new burials. After an effort to acquire an additional acre of Barnes Common was blocked by local residents, the cemetery was closed to burials in the mid-1950s. Without maintenance, its condition deteriorated. Without protection, it became a hangout for hooligans. In 1966, the London Borough of Richmond-upon-Thames assumed responsibility for the cemetery. It planned to transform it into a lawn cemetery by relocating gravestones to the perimeter and laying new memorials flat on a new lawn. However, after demolishing the mortuary chapel and removing the surrounding gates, walls and railings, Richmond Borough Council decided that the transformation would be just too costly to complete and abandoned the cemetery. Neglected, it became increasingly overgrown. A blanket of vegetation spread its tentacles across the burial ground. Pathways disappeared. A shroud of bramble and bracken strangled smaller monuments. An apron of vines and leaves swaddled the base of tall structures. The true magnitude of the devastation only became obvious when the Friends of Barnes Common, a voluntary organisation formed in 1992, began to clean up the cemetery. After they cleared pathways, removed litter, and pruned some of the overgrowth, they discovered that some of the headstones were sinking into the ground. Wind and rain had weathered memorials. Many dedications lovingly inscribed were indecipherable. The destruction had been hastened by vandals who fractured memorials and looted tops of monuments, including the heads of numerous statues. John Pullen's classical monument not only has a missing head, this empty niche may at one time have been adorned with an urn or plaque. Though many graves were ruined, it was not all doom and gloom. The flora and fauna flourished, so much so that in 1980 the cemetery was reincorporated into Barnes Common. It became a valuable wildlife sanctuary and a significant breeding ground for native and migrating birds. In addition to conserving its natural resources, the Friends of Barnes Common now maintain on behalf of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission 10 graves of military service personnel from the two world wars. They also take care of graves declared to be of special national or local significance. Despite the public-spirited contribution of volunteers, most of the monuments, many over 100 years old and fragile, will continue to decay and crumble. Responsibility for their preservation lies with the descendants of those who are buried here, many of whom no longer live nearby, while others don't have the time or money, or motivation perhaps, to maintain graves and repair memorials. This disused cemetery is well worth a visit. Despite being small, there's much to see and discover, including a variety of Victorian monuments, funerary art, emotive dedications, and a flourishing nature reserve. It's an oasis of rest and contemplation. Richmond Council doesn't exaggerate when it describes Barnes Cemetery as a romantic place with an evocative atmosphere of decay and seclusion.